The blood-red sunset painted the Wyoming sky as Faith Forrester clutched the deed to her family's ranch in trembling hands. At 22, she never imagined standing at the freshly dug grave of her father, the last living relative she had in this harsh world of 1875. The Broken F Ranch outside Montrose, Wyoming was now hers alone, as were the mounting debts and threats that came with it. "I am truly sorry for your loss, Miss Forrester," said the town's undertaker, a man who had grown uncomfortably familiar to Faith after burying her mother 2 years prior and now her father. "Your pa was a good man." Faith nodded, unable to speak past the knot in her throat. The small gathering of mourners had already dispersed, heading back to town before nightfall. She stood alone now, the cooling evening air sending shivers across her skin that had nothing to do with temperature. "You won't last a month out here by yourself," came a gravelly voice from behind her. Faith turned to face Silas Morgan, the wealthy rancher whose property bordered her own. At 55, his weathered face and cold eyes had always unnerved her, even when her father was alive to stand between them. "The land is mine, Mr. Morgan," she said, straightening her spine despite her fatigue. "For now." His thin lips curved into what might have been a smile. "Your father borrowed heavily these past years. Those debts passed to you. I've purchased most of them from the bank." He adjusted his hat, casting his face in shadow. "I'll be calling them due at the end of the month." "That's only 3 weeks," Faith protested, her heart pounding. "Then I suggest you find a way to pay or prepare to sell." He mounted his horse with surprising agility for a man his age. "Or you could accept my standing offer of marriage. Your choice, Miss Forrester." As he rode away, Faith felt tears threatening. The offer had been hanging over her since her 20th birthday, an arrangement that would see Morgan gain her land while she became little more than property herself. Her father had protected her from the man's persistent advances, but now she stood alone. The ranch hands had already begun drifting away, seeking work elsewhere as rumors of the ranch's financial troubles spread. By tomorrow, she suspected only old Hank would remain, too loyal and too ancient to find work elsewhere. Faith made her way back to the ranch house as darkness fell, the weight of her situation pressing down upon her with each step. The modest 2-story home her grandfather had built seemed to sag with the same grief that bent her shoulders. Inside, she slumped at the kitchen table, unfolding the papers she'd found in her father's desk. The numbers confirmed Morgan's claims they were drowning in debt. The drought had killed much of their cattle 2 seasons ago, and her father had borrowed heavily to rebuild the herd. Then came his illness, draining what little reserves they had. A knock at the door startled her. Faith quickly wiped her eyes and smoothed her black mourning dress before answering. Sheriff Campbell stood on her porch, hat in hand. "Evening, Miss Faith. Just checking you're settling in all right after the service." "As well as can be expected, Sheriff," she replied, forcing a polite smile. "I heard Morgan rode out this way." The older man's face creased with concern. "He came to offer his condolences," Faith said, the lie bitter on her tongue, "and I'm sure that's all it was." The sheriff didn't bother hiding his skepticism. "Listen, if you need anything, thank you, but I'll manage." Pride made her chin lift slightly. After the sheriff departed, Faith returned to the table and its discouraging paperwork. The ranch needed a miracle, or at least $500 by month's end. She had precisely $12.43 to her name. Sleep evaded her that night, her mind racing with increasingly desperate plans. By dawn, she had only one option that didn't involve accepting Morgan's proposal. She would have to sell most of the remaining cattle and pray it would be enough. The morning brought another, unwelcome surprise. Faith stepped onto the porch to find Hank hobbling toward her, his weathered face grim. "They're gone, Miss Faith," he said, his voice quavering with age and distress. "What's gone?" "The cattle. Every last one that was in the north pasture must have been rustled during the night." Faith's knees weakened and she gripped the porch rail to steady herself. Over 60 head of cattle, their most valuable asset, stolen in a single night. "Did you see anything? Anyone?" she asked, already knowing the answer. "Nothing, miss, but—" Hank hesitated, twisting his hat in gnarled hands. "But what, Hank?" Some of Morgan's boys were drinking at the saloon yesterday, talking loud about how the broken F would soon be part of the Circle M anyway. He couldn't meet her eyes. "Seems mighty coincidental." Faith's hands clenched into fists. "We can't prove anything." "No, miss. We can't." By mid-morning, she had ridden into Montrose to report the theft to Sheriff Campbell. The small town consisted of little more than a main street lined with wooden buildings, a general store, saloon, hotel, bank, and a handful of other establishments serving the surrounding ranches. The sheriff's office sat between the jailhouse and the telegraph office. Faith tied her horse outside and stepped into the sparse front room where Campbell was reading a wanted poster. "Miss Forrester," he said, rising quickly. "What brings you to town so soon after rustlers?" she interrupted. "They took all the cattle from the north pasture last night." Campbell's expression darkened. "That's over 60 head. 63, Faith confirmed. "And I suspect Silas Morgan is behind it." The sheriff sighed heavily. "That's a serious accusation, Miss Faith." "One you're not going to investigate," she challenged. "I didn't say that." He reached for his hat. "But Morgan is a powerful man in these parts. I'll need more than suspicion to move against him. While you gather your evidence, I lose everything." Faith couldn't keep the bitterness from her voice. "I'll ride out and look for tracks," Campbell promised. "But cattle rustling has been increasing all across the territory. Could be any number of outfits." As Faith turned to leave, the door swung open, revealing a stranger who filled the frame with his broad shoulders. He stepped aside, allowing her passage with a respectful touch to his hat brim. "Madam," he said simply, his voice deep. Faith nodded curtly as she passed, too consumed by her troubles to pay the man much notice. Outside, she paused on the boardwalk, the morning sun already hot on her face. The theft had eliminated her only viable option for saving the ranch. Unless she could recover the cattle or find another source of income immediately, Morgan would have his way, either taking her land or forcing her into a marriage she couldn't bear to contemplate. Faith crossed to the general store, hoping Mr. Abernathy might extend her credit for supplies. As she reached for the door, a commotion from the saloon across the street caught her attention. 3 men burst through the swinging doors, dragging a fourth between them. She recognized Morgan's foreman and 2 of his hands, but the man they were roughing up was unfamiliar. "You picked the wrong town to start trouble, drifter," the foreman shouted, landing a solid punch that sent the stranger staggering backward into the dirt street. The man regained his footing with surprising grace, wiping blood from his lip. "All I did was ask questions," he replied calmly, his eyes never leaving his attackers. "And I'm giving you answers. Clear out of Montrose if you know what's good for you." The stranger seemed unimpressed by the threat. He stood tall in the center of the street, his stance relaxed but somehow alert. Faith noticed now that he wore a gun belt with practiced ease, though he made no move toward the weapon. 3 against 1 seems hardly sporting," the stranger commented, rolling his shoulders. The foreman spat in the dirt. "Morgan doesn't want your kind around here. Last warning." Something about the confrontation struck Faith as odd. The stranger hadn't been in town long enough to cause genuine trouble. What questions could have provoked such a response? The sheriff emerged from his office, drawn by the disturbance. "That's enough, Delaney," he called to Morgan's foreman. Take your boys and head back to the Circle M. Delaney glared but signaled his men to stand down. This isn't finished, he warned the stranger before the three men mounted their horses and rode off. The stranger dusted himself off as the sheriff approached. Faith found herself moving closer, curiosity temporarily displacing her own problems. Mind telling me what that was about? Campbell asked the man. I asked if anyone had seen unusual cattle movements last night, the stranger replied. Those gentlemen took exception to my inquiry. Faith stiffened at his words, her attention now fully captured. And why would you be asking about cattle movements? The sheriff pressed. The stranger's gaze flicked briefly to Faith before returning to Campbell. I've been tracking a herd that was rustled from the Collins spread near Cheyenne. Trail led this way. You a lawman? Campbell seemed skeptical, not officially. The man reached slowly into his vest and produced a folded paper. Vaughn Westfield. I hunt bounties occasionally, but right now I'm working for the Wyoming Stock Growers Association. They've hired me to investigate the recent rustling operations. Faith stepped forward before she could stop herself. My cattle were stolen last night, 63 head. Westfield turned toward her, and Faith found herself fixed in the steady gaze of eyes the color of a summer storm. He assessed her quickly, taking in her mourning clothes and determined expression. Your ranch, madam? He asked. The Broken F north of town, Faith Forrester. She offered her hand without thinking, a gesture typically reserved for men's business dealings. To his credit, Westfield didn't hesitate to take it, his grip firm but respectful. Miss Forrester, I'm sorry for your loss both kinds. Sheriff Campbell cleared his throat. I was just about to ride out to the Broken F to investigate the rustling. If you don't mind, Sheriff, I'd like to join you, Westfield said. If it's the same outfit I've been tracking, I might recognize their methods. Campbell nodded slowly. Miss Forrester, are you heading back to the ranch now? After I speak with Mr. Abernathy at the store, she confirmed. We'll meet you there within the hour, the sheriff promised. Faith completed her errand with mixed success. Abernathy extended limited credit, enough for essentials but not the supplies she truly needed for ranch operations. As she rode home, her mind kept returning to the confrontation in town. Morgan's men had reacted violently to simple questions about cattle movements. It seemed to confirm her suspicions about who was behind the rustling, but proving it would be another matter entirely. At the ranch, Faith found Hank attempting to repair a section of fence that had been cut during the theft. The old man's hands shook with the effort of wielding the wire cutters. Hank, please don't strain yourself, she called, dismounting to help him. Got to secure what little we have left, he insisted, though he relinquished the tools gratefully. They worked together until the sound of approaching horses announced the arrival of Sheriff Campbell and Vaughn Westfield. Up close, Faith could better assess the stranger who had offered to help investigate. He was younger than she'd first thought, perhaps 30, with features weathered by sun and wind rather than age. He dismounted with the fluid movement of someone who spent most of his life in the saddle. Miss Forrester, Campbell greeted her. This is where they broke through, Faith nodded, gesturing to the mended fence. They cut the wire here and drove the herd north, according to the tracks Hank found this morning. Westfield was already kneeling to examine the ground, his expression focused. How many men would you estimate? He asked Hank. From the hoofprints, I'd say at least 4, maybe 5, the old ranch hand replied. Professionals, too. They knew exactly where the herd was kept and the quickest way to move them. Someone familiar with your operation, Westfield noted, looking up at Faith. Or someone who's been watching, she replied, the implication clear in her tone. Show me the tracks, Westfield requested, mounting his horse again. For the next hour they followed the trail left by the rustlers. The hoofprints led north before veering east toward a rocky ridge that marked the border between the Broken F and Morgan's Circle M ranch. Here, the tracks became confused, splitting in multiple directions. "Classic tactic," Westfield explained, dismounting to examine the ground more closely. "They split the herd here, probably into 3 groups, making it harder to follow. And harder to prove they all went to the same place," the sheriff added grimly. "The tracks leading east go straight toward Morgan's property," Faith pointed out. Campbell removed his hat, wiping sweat from his brow. "That they do, Miss Faith, but they fade out among these rocks. Without being able to follow them directly to Morgan's corrals, we don't have proof. So he just gets away with it." Faith's voice rose in frustration. "Not necessarily," Westfield said quietly, still studying the ground. "These men were careful, but they weren't ghosts." He pointed to a distinctive mark in the dirt. "This horse has a crack in its right front shoe, makes a unique impression. If we find that horse at Morgan's ranch—" "It would be circumstantial at best," Campbell cautioned. "Any decent lawyer would argue it's coincidence." "Then we need more than circumstantial evidence," Westfield replied, standing and dusting off his hands. "What if we could find the cattle themselves?" "Morgan's not stupid enough to keep stolen Broken F cattle on his property where they can be identified," the sheriff said. "Not on his main ranch, no," Westfield agreed. "But operations this size usually have holding areas away from their main property places to keep stolen stock until they can be rebranded or moved to market." Hope flickered in Faith's chest for the first time since discovering the theft. "If we could find those cattle—" "It would mean searching a lot of territory," Campbell warned. "Morgan controls over 10,000 acres. Then we'd better get started," Westfield said simply. As they rode back toward the ranch house, Faith found herself studying the bounty hunter more carefully. There was something reassuring about his methodical approach and quiet confidence that made her want to trust him, despite having just met the man. "Mr. Westfield," she began, "why are you so willing to help?" "The Stock Growers Association sent you to investigate rustling, but surely not to solve every case personally." He glanced at her, those storm gray eyes assessing again. "I follow the evidence, Miss Forrester. Right now, it suggests the outfit I'm tracking is the same one that took your cattle. Their methods match cases I've investigated from Cheyenne to here. And you think Morgan is behind all of it?" "I think Morgan benefits from it," he replied carefully. "Whether he's directly involved or simply creating opportunities for others, I can't say yet. But it's no coincidence that small ranchers are being hit just when their finances make them vulnerable to buyouts." Faith felt a chill despite the afternoon heat. "You know about that? It's a pattern I've seen before." Westfield's expression darkened. "Wealthy ranchers using any means necessary to expand their holdings." At the ranch house, Sheriff Campbell prepared to return to town. "I'll ask around discreetly, see if anyone's noticed unusual activity on Morgan's outlying properties," he promised Faith. "And I'll continue tracking the other trails," Westfield added. "With your permission, Miss Forrester, I might use your ranch as a base for a few days. It would draw less attention than staying in town." Faith hesitated only briefly. Having a capable man around the ranch even temporarily would provide some security she sorely needed. "There's a bunkhouse the hands used. It's empty now except for Hank, but you're welcome to it." "Much obliged." Westfield tipped his hat. After the sheriff departed, Faith showed Westfield to the bunkhouse, a long, low building with several cots that once housed a full complement of ranch hands. Now, only Hank's few possessions occupied one corner. "It's not much," Faith apologized, "but there's a pump out back for washing." "It's palace compared to where I've slept recently," Westfield assured her, setting his saddlebags on an empty cot. "Thank you for your hospitality, Miss Forrester." "Mr. Westfield," she said, pausing at the door, "what happens if we can prove Morgan took my cattle but can't recover them?" His expression softened slightly at the worry evident in her voice. "One problem at a time. First, we find the evidence. Then we decide how to use it." That evening, Faith invited Westfield to join her and Hank for a simple supper at the main house. As they ate, she learned more about the man who had unexpectedly entered their lives. Vaughn Westfield had grown up on a small ranch in Colorado, lost to creditors after his father's death when he was 16. He'd worked cattle drives, served as a scout during the war, and eventually found his way into bounty hunting, a profession that utilized his tracking skills and knowledge of the frontier. "The Stock Growers Association hired me after 3 of their members lost significant herds in what appeared to be connected thefts," he explained between bites of stew. "I've been following the trail for almost 2 months now, and it led you here," Faith said. "To Montrose specifically," he confirmed. "I had information that a large operation was being coordinated from this area. I just didn't know who was behind it until Morgan's men made such an effort to warn me off. Morgan's been trying to buy up every small spread in the county," Hank contributed. "Broken F is one of the last holdouts, mainly because of the water rights. Our creek feeds half the valley." Westfield nodded thoughtfully. "Control the water, control the land. It's an old strategy." "Well, he's about to control both unless I can raise $500 by the end of the month," Faith said bitterly, the reality of her situation reasserting itself. "That's how much you owe?" Westfield asked. "That's the amount Morgan says is due immediately." Faith pushed her plate away, her appetite gone. "The total debt is much higher, but he's calling in the note that gives him first claim on the property." "Convenient timing," Westfield observed, "right after your cattle disappear." He also offered an alternative. Faith couldn't keep the disgust from her voice. "I could marry him instead." Westfield's expression hardened. "I see." "I would rather lose the ranch," she said firmly. "Let's make sure neither happens," he replied, his quiet determination somehow more reassuring than any grand promise could have been. After supper, Hank retired to the bunkhouse, but Faith found herself reluctant to end the evening. She and Westfield sat on the porch, watching darkness settle over the land. The vast Wyoming sky blazed with stars, a sight Faith had seen every night of her life but never tired of. "Your father built this place?" Westfield asked, breaking the comfortable silence. "My grandfather did," she corrected. "Settled here right after the war, the Mexican War, that is. My father expanded it, though, or tried to." Faith sighed, memories of her father's endless optimism washing over her. "He always believed next season would be better." "Ranchers have to believe that," Westfield said gently. "Otherwise, why continue?" "Why indeed," Faith murmured, more to herself than to him. The next morning brought unexpected visitors. Faith was collecting eggs from the henhouse when the sound of approaching riders drew her attention. Her heart sank as she recognized Silas Morgan leading 3 of his men, including the foreman who had confronted Westfield in town. "Miss Forrester," Morgan called out, his voice carrying across the yard. "I've come to discuss our business arrangement." Faith set down her basket of eggs and smoothed her skirts, wishing she were wearing something more substantial than her worn work dress. "Mr. Morgan, I wasn't expecting you, clearly." His gaze swept dismissively over her practical attire. "I thought it best to visit in person when I heard about your misfortune with the cattle." "News travels fast," Faith replied coldly. "It's a small county." Morgan dismounted, handing his reins to one of his men. "Walk with me, Miss Forrester. We have matters to discuss." It wasn't a request. Faith reluctantly fell into step beside him as he led her away from the house toward the corral where her remaining horses grazed. "I understand Sheriff Campbell is investigating your loss," Morgan said casually. "Any progress?" "Not yet." Faith kept her answers brief, unwilling to reveal Westfield's involvement. "Rustling is becoming all too common these days," Morgan continued with feigned sympathy. "All the more reason a young woman shouldn't be managing a ranch alone. It's simply not safe." "I can manage my own affairs, Mr. Morgan," he chuckled, the sound devoid of genuine humor. "Your current circumstances suggest otherwise, my dear, which brings me to the purpose of my visit." Morgan stopped walking and turned to face her directly. "In light of your recent setback, I'm prepared to be generous. I'll forgive half the debt if you accept my marriage proposal now, rather than waiting until the end of the month." Faith felt her body go rigid with anger and revulsion. "That's very considerate of you, Mr. Morgan." "But my answer remains the same." His expression hardened. "Don't be foolish, girl. Without those cattle, you have no way to raise the money. Even if you sold every horse on the place, it wouldn't cover what you owe." "Perhaps not," came a voice from behind them. "But it would cover a decent lawyer to investigate how those debts were accumulated so rapidly." Faith turned to find Vaughn Westfield approaching, his manner relaxed, but his eyes alert. He must have seen the riders arrive and circled around to approach unnoticed. Morgan's face flushed with anger. "Who the hell are you?" "Just a friend of Miss Forrester's," Westfield replied, coming to stand beside Faith. "Vaughn Westfield." Recognition flashed in Morgan's eyes. "You're the troublemaker from town." "Seems trouble follows me," Westfield agreed pleasantly. "Or perhaps I follow it." Morgan's foreman and the other men had noticed the conversation and were now moving their horses closer. The tension in the air thickened palpably. "This is a private discussion," Morgan said coldly. "I suggest you make yourself scarce, Westfield." "I'm afraid I can't do that," Westfield replied, his tone still conversational though his posture had subtly shifted. "You see, Miss Forrester has hired me to investigate the theft of her cattle." Faith kept her expression neutral, though this was news to her. Whatever game Westfield was playing, she instinctively knew to follow his lead. Morgan's laugh held no mirth. "A gunslinger playing detective. How desperate you must be, Miss Forrester." "Mr. Westfield has considerable experience tracking rustlers," Faith responded, finding her voice. "The Wyoming Stock Growers Association seems to value his skills." The mention of the powerful ranchers' organization caused Morgan's smug expression to falter momentarily. "The association has no jurisdiction here." "True," Westfield acknowledged. "But they have connections with territorial officials who take a dim view of organized rustling operations, especially when those operations target vulnerable ranchers facing financial pressure." Morgan's face reddened further. "Are you accusing me of something, Mr.?" "Not at all," Westfield replied smoothly. "Just making an observation about coincidences. They do pile up around here, don't they?" For a tense moment, no one spoke. Faith could feel Morgan calculating, reassessing whatever plans he had made when riding onto her property. "I didn't come here to bandy words with a hired gun," Morgan finally said, turning back to Faith. "My offer stands until the end of the week. After that, I expect payment in full when the note comes due." He moved toward his horse, then paused. "And Miss Forrester?" "I'd be careful about the company you keep. Some men bring nothing but trouble." After Morgan and his men rode away, Faith released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "Thank you for intervening." Westfield's eyes remained on the departing riders. "He's worried. That's good." "Is it true that you're working for me now?" Faith asked, a hint of amusement creeping into her voice despite the situation. Westfield turned to her with the ghost of a smile. I may have overstated our arrangement, but I am investigating the theft of your cattle, and it does appear to be connected to my assignment for the association. His expression grew serious again. Morgan's pressing hard. That suggests he's on a timeline of his own. What do you mean? Men like Morgan don't typically show their hand so clearly unless they're under pressure. Westfield gazed thoughtfully in the direction the rancher had disappeared. He's building something, an empire, maybe, and he needs your water rights to complete it. But why now? The broken F has been here for decades. That's what we need to find out. Westfield turned his attention back to Faith. I'm going to follow one of the other cattle trails today, see where it leads. If I'm not back by nightfall, don't worry. I might need to observe from a distance for a while. Faith nodded, an unexpected concern for this man she barely knew rising within her. Be careful, Mr. Westfield. Morgan's men won't hesitate to shoot a trespasser. I'm reasonably good at not being seen when I don't want to be, he assured her. And please call me Vaughn. Mr. Westfield makes me feel like I'm in trouble with a schoolmarm. The unexpected touch of humor caught Faith by surprise, drawing a genuine smile from her for the first time in days. Very well, Vaughn. I'm Faith. He tipped his hat with a small nod before heading toward the barn to saddle his horse. Faith watched him go, struck by the strange turn her life had taken. 3 days ago, she had been alone against Morgan and his schemes. Now, she had an ally, one who seemed genuinely determined to help her. The day passed slowly as Faith attended to the necessary chores of running the ranch, even one as diminished as the broken F had become. She checked on the remaining livestock, mended a section of barn roof with Hank's assistance, and tried not to watch the horizon for Vaughn's return. Afternoon faded to evening with no sign of him. Faith prepared a simple dinner for herself and Hank, setting aside a portion for Vaughn should he return later. As darkness fell, she lit a lamp in the window, a habit her mother had started years ago to guide her father home on late nights. Don't you worry about Mr. Westfield, Hank said, noticing her frequent glances toward the window. Man like that knows how to take care of himself. I'm sure you're right, Faith agreed, though the knot of worry in her stomach didn't ease. She was washing the dinner dishes when the sound of hoofbeats finally reached her ears. Faith quickly dried her hands and moved to the door, relief washing over her at the sight of Vaughn dismounting in the yard. The relief was short-lived, however, when she noticed he was favoring his left side. You're hurt, she said as he approached the porch. Just a graze, he replied, though his grimace as he climbed the steps suggested otherwise. I had an unfriendly encounter with one of Morgan's fence riders. Faith immediately moved to help him inside. Sit down. I'll get some water and bandages. It's really not necessary, he began, but Faith was already heading for the kitchen. She returned with a basin of water, clean cloths, and her mother's old medicine box. Take off your shirt, she instructed, setting the supplies on the table beside him. Vaughn raised an eyebrow at her directness, but complied without further protest, unbuttoning his shirt to reveal a well-muscled torso marked with a bloody furrow across his ribs. The wound was indeed a graze, but deeper than he had implied. Faith focused on the task at hand, cleaning the wound with practiced efficiency. Growing up on a ranch had given her ample experience tending injuries. What happened? She asked as she worked. I followed the trail to a box canyon about 15 miles northeast of here, Vaughn explained, wincing slightly as she applied antiseptic. It's well hidden, wouldn't find it unless you knew where to look. Inside, I found a holding pen with cattle bearing brands from 3 different ranches, including yours. Faith's hand stilled momentarily. You found them. My cattle, some of them, he confirmed. About 20 head with the broken F brand. The rest had brands from the Collins and Hargrove spreads, both operations that were forced to sell to Morgan in the past year. "So we have proof," Faith said, hope rising in her chest. "We would," Vaughn replied grimly, "except the canyon is guarded. One of Morgan's men spotted me as I was leaving, hence this." He nodded toward the wound she was bandaging. "Did he recognize you?" "I don't think so. It was nearly dark, and I didn't exactly stop to introduce myself when he started shooting." Vaughn managed a wry smile. "But he'll report an intruder, which means Morgan will know someone's found his operation." Faith secured the bandage and sat back, her mind racing. "We need to tell Sheriff Campbell." "Agreed, but we should be careful how we approach this," Vaughn cautioned. "If Morgan has influence with local law enforcement, the sheriff is honest," Faith interrupted firmly. "He's known me my entire life. He may be cautious about confronting someone as powerful as Morgan, but he won't ignore evidence of rustling." Vaughn nodded slowly. "All right. First light tomorrow, we'll ride into town and speak with him." Faith questioned. "You know the sheriff better than I do," Vaughn pointed out. "He's more likely to take action if you're the one requesting it." Faith couldn't argue with his logic, though the prospect of directly confronting Morgan's operation was daunting. "Very well. First light." After ensuring Vaughn had eaten the dinner she'd saved for him, Faith retired to her bedroom, though sleep proved elusive. The discovery of her cattle confirmed what she had suspected: Morgan was behind the rustling. But would it be enough to stop him from taking her ranch? And even if they recovered the stolen herd, how would she manage afterward? The financial problems that had plagued her father hadn't disappeared with the theft. They had merely been overshadowed by the more immediate crisis. Morning came too quickly. Faith, dressed in her most respectable riding outfit, a navy blue split skirt and matching jacket that had been her mother's. She braided her light brown hair and pinned it up neatly, wanting to present a composed, capable appearance when they spoke to the sheriff. Vaughn was already in the yard when she emerged, saddling his horse despite the obvious discomfort from his wound. Faith saddled her own mount, a reliable bay mare named Penny. "How are you feeling?" she asked, noting the tightness around his eyes. "I've had worse," he replied, adjusting his gun belt. "Let's hope the sheriff is an early riser." They rode toward Montrose as the sun crested the eastern mountains, painting the landscape in hues of gold and amber. Faith found herself stealing glances at her companion, struck by how natural it felt to ride beside him despite having known him only days. The town was just coming to life as they arrived, shopkeepers sweeping boardwalks and freight wagons preparing for the day's deliveries. Faith and Vaughn tied their horses outside the sheriff's office and found Campbell already at his desk, a cup of coffee cooling before him. "Miss Faith," he greeted her with surprise. "And Mr. Westfield, you're out and about early." "We have information about my stolen cattle," Faith said without preamble. Campbell's expression sharpened with interest. "What kind of information?" Vaughn stepped forward. "I tracked one of the trails to a box canyon northeast of here. There's a holding pen there with cattle bearing the Broken F brand, along with stock from other ranches Morgan has acquired over the past year." The sheriff leaned back in his chair, absorbing this news. "You saw this yourself?" "Yes," Vaughn confirmed, "and one of Morgan's men saw me. I took a bullet for my trouble." He gestured to his side. Campbell's frown deepened. "That's a serious situation, if Morgan's men are shooting at people investigating rustling." "It's more than rustling," Faith interjected. "It's a systematic effort to force ranchers to sell to him. He steals our cattle, calls in our debts, and then offers to save us by buying our land for a fraction of its value, or in my case, offering marriage instead of foreclosure." The sheriff removed his hat and ran a hand through his thinning hair. "I believe you, Miss Faith. I've had my suspicions about Morgan for some time, but nothing concrete enough to act on. This could be the evidence we need." He stood, reaching for his gun belt. "I'll need to verify what Mr. Westfield saw. If those cattle are where you say they are, with the brand still visible, we can bring charges against whoever's operating that holding pen." "Morgan will deny any knowledge of it," Faith pointed out. "He'll claim his men were acting without his authorization." "Likely so," Campbell agreed, "but it will disrupt his operation and might give us time to find connections leading directly to him." He strapped on his gun belt and reached for his rifle. "I can deputize a few men in town and ride out there today. We should move quickly," Vaughn advised. "Once Morgan learns I found the canyon, he'll likely move the cattle or accelerate his timeline." The sheriff nodded grimly. "Give me an hour to gather some men. In the meantime, you two should stay out of sight. Morgan has eyes all over town." Faith and Vaughn agreed to wait at the livery stable, a neutral location where their presence wouldn't immediately raise suspicions. As they led their horses down the alley behind the main street, Faith felt a spark of hope for the first time since her father's death. If they could recover her cattle and expose Morgan's operation, perhaps she could save the ranch after all. The livery stable was quiet at this early hour, with only the stable boy mucking out stalls. He greeted Faith respectfully. She had known him since he was a child, and showed them to an empty tack room where they could wait without being observed. "You think the sheriff will be able to gather enough men?" Faith asked once they were alone. "Depends on how many in town are willing to stand against Morgan," Vaughn replied, settling onto a bench with a slight wince. "But Campbell strikes me as a man who takes his duties seriously." "He does," Faith confirmed. "He and my father were friends. I think he's wanted to move against Morgan for some time but lacks sufficient cause." Vaughn nodded thoughtfully. "Finding stolen cattle with their original brand still visible is about as clear a cause as one could hope for." They fell into companionable silence, the only sounds the distant activity of the town awakening and the occasional nickering of horses in the stable. Faith found her gaze drawn repeatedly to Vaughn's profile as he sat lost in thought, his expression focused and determined. There was something compelling about him beyond his obvious capability, a sense of integrity that resonated with her own values. "Why did you decide to help me?" she asked suddenly. "Your assignment was to investigate rustling for the association, not to save my ranch." Vaughn turned those storm-gray eyes toward her, his expression softening slightly. "The two aren't separate issues. Morgan's rustling operation is targeting ranchers like you people who have worked the land honestly for generations, only to have it stolen through underhanded means." He paused, something vulnerable briefly crossing his features. "I told you my family lost our ranch when I was 16. What I didn't mention was that it happened much the same way: cattle mysteriously disappearing, debts suddenly coming due, and a neighboring rancher conveniently positioned to rescue us by buying the land for a pittance." "I'm sorry," Faith said softly. "What happened to your family?" "My mother had already passed. My father—" Vaughn's jaw tightened. He couldn't face the shame of losing everything he'd built. He took his own life the day after we were forced to sell. Faith instinctively reached out, her hand covering his where it rested on his knee. "That's why this matters so much to you." He nodded once, his eyes meeting hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "No one fought for us then, but I can fight for you now." The simple declaration hung in the air between them, weighted with meaning beyond the immediate situation. Faith became acutely aware of her hand still resting on his, of the warmth of his skin beneath her fingers, of the slight quickening of her pulse. The moment was broken by the sound of boots on the stable floor. Faith withdrew her hand as the stable boy appeared in the doorway. "Miss Forrester, there's someone asking for you at the front." Faith exchanged a concerned glance with Vaughn. They weren't expecting anyone, and the sheriff had warned them to stay out of sight. "Who is it?" she asked. "Mr. Morgan's foreman," the boy replied nervously. "Says he needs to speak with you urgent-like." Faith felt a chill run through her. "Did you tell him I was here?" "No, madam. Just said I'd check if you'd been by." Vaughn rose smoothly despite his injury, his hand moving instinctively to his sidearm. "We need to leave. Now." "There's a back door through the tack room," Faith said, already moving. "It leads to the alley behind the mercantile." They retrieved their horses quickly and slipped out the back way, the stable boy promising to tell Morgan's foreman he hadn't seen them. As they emerged into the narrow alley, the sound of multiple riders entering town from the north reached them. "Morgan's men," Vaughn murmured, guiding his horse deeper into the shadows of the alley. "He must have sent for reinforcements when he learned the canyon was discovered." "What about Sheriff Campbell?" Faith whispered. "We need to warn him before he rides into an ambush." Vaughn peered carefully around the corner of the building. "The sheriff's office is across the street, but there are men watching it, 3 that I can see." Faith felt fear clawing at her throat, but pushed it down. "There's another way. Follow me." She led him through a maze of back alleys and narrow passages between buildings, using knowledge gained from a childhood spent exploring every corner of the small town. They emerged behind the jailhouse, which connected to the sheriff's office through a rear door. "Wait here with the horses," Vaughn instructed, drawing his revolver. "If there's trouble, ride for the ranch and don't look back." Before Faith could protest, he had slipped inside the building. She waited, heart pounding, one hand on Penny's bridle to keep the mare quiet and the other holding the reins of Vaughn's mount. Minutes stretched interminably until the door opened again, and Vaughn reappeared with Sheriff Campbell. "Morgan's moved faster than we anticipated," the sheriff said grimly as he joined them. "He's got men positioned throughout town, and word is he's on his way personally with more riders." "What about the deputies you were going to gather?" Faith asked. Campbell's expression turned apologetic. "2 agreed to help, but they're trapped at the saloon now. Morgan's foreman has men watching them." "So it's just us," Vaughn concluded, his voice steady despite the odds. "Not necessarily," the sheriff replied. "I sent a telegraph to the U.S. Marshal's office in Cheyenne yesterday after you first mentioned finding the stolen cattle. If Morgan is operating an organized rustling ring across multiple counties, that falls under federal jurisdiction." "How long until they can respond?" Faith asked. 2 days at the earliest," Campbell admitted. "We don't have 2 days," Vaughn said. "Morgan will have moved those cattle by then, and any evidence connecting him to the rustling will disappear." The sheriff nodded grimly. "Which is why we need to act now, even with limited numbers. I know that canyon used to hunt there as a boy. There's a back way in that few people remember. If we can reach it unobserved, we might be able to document the stolen herd before Morgan can move them." "And then what?" Faith demanded. "Even with evidence, Morgan has half the county in his pocket." "Not the federal marshal," Campbell pointed out, "and not Judge Harmon, who's due to hold court in Cheyenne next week, if we can preserve the evidence until then." "It's worth trying," Vaughn decided, turning to Faith. "But you should stay somewhere safe until this is resolved." Faith straightened her spine, meeting his gaze directly. "This is my ranch, my cattle, and my fight, Mr. Westfield. I'm coming with you." For a moment she thought he would argue, but instead, a look of respect and something warmer flickered in his eyes. "All right. But you stay behind us when we reach the canyon." They formulated a plan to slip out of town separately to avoid drawing attention. The sheriff would leave first, taking a visible route north before doubling back to meet them at a designated location. Faith and Vaughn would wait 10 minutes, then ride out the south edge of town before circling east toward the rendezvous point. As they prepared to part ways, Campbell gripped Vaughn's shoulder. "Watch out for her," he said quietly, though Faith still heard him. "Her father was one of the best men I ever knew." "I'll protect her with my life," Vaughn replied with such conviction that Faith felt something shift inside her chest, a recognition that this man, this stranger who had appeared so suddenly in her life, truly meant to stand between her and harm. The plan to leave town unnoticed nearly failed before it began. As Faith and Vaughn prepared to mount their horses in the alley behind the jailhouse, the sound of approaching riders forced them to retreat deeper into the shadows. 4 of Morgan's men rode slowly past the end of the alley, clearly searching for someone. "They're looking for us," Faith whispered, pressed close to Vaughn in the narrow space between buildings. "More likely for the sheriff," Vaughn replied softly, his breath warm against her ear. "They want to prevent him from investigating the canyon." They waited until the riders passed, then quickly mounted and moved in the opposite direction, keeping to back alleys and side streets until they reached the southern edge of town. Once clear of the buildings, they urged their horses to a gallop, heading south until they were certain no one followed before turning east toward the meeting point with Campbell. The sheriff was already waiting when they arrived at the old lightning-struck oak that served as their landmark. "No sign of pursuit," he reported as they dismounted to confer. "But Morgan's gathering men in town." A freight driver passing through said he counted at least 15 riders assembling at the saloon. "He's preparing for war," Vaughn observed grimly. "Or ensuring we can't gather enough men to challenge him," Campbell suggested. "Either way, we need to move fast. The canyon is about an hour's ride northeast from here." They set out immediately, pushing their horses as much as they dared across the rugged terrain. Faith's mind raced with the implications of what they were attempting. If they succeeded in documenting the stolen cattle, they would have evidence of Morgan's crimes. But even then, would it be enough to save her ranch? The debts were real, regardless of how they had been engineered, and the deadline for payment remained. As if sensing her thoughts, Vaughn guided his horse alongside hers. "One step at a time," he said quietly. "First, we secure the evidence, then we address the rest." Faith nodded, drawing strength from his steady presence. "Thank you for all of it." "Don't thank me yet," he replied, though his expression softened when he looked at her. "We're still in the thick of it." The terrain grew increasingly rugged as they approached the canyon, forcing them to slow their pace. Sheriff Campbell led them on a circuitous route that avoided the main entrance, instead climbing a steep, rocky trail that wound along the canyon's rim. "The back entrance is just ahead," Campbell said, dismounting and securing his horse to a stunted pine. "We'll have to proceed on foot from here. Too narrow for the horses." Faith and Vaughn followed suit, tethering their mounts alongside the sheriff's. Vaughn checked his revolver while Campbell readied his rifle. Faith felt strangely vulnerable without a weapon of her own, though she knew her skills with firearms were limited to the occasional pest control around the ranch. "Stay behind us," Vaughn reminded her as they prepared to descend the narrow path into the canyon. "If there's trouble, find cover immediately." Faith nodded, gathering her split skirt to allow easier movement on the rocky trail. Campbell took the lead, with Vaughn following and Faith bringing up the rear. The path was treacherous in places, forcing them to pick their way carefully down the steep incline. As they neared the bottom of the canyon, Campbell raised a hand, signaling for them to stop and remain silent. Faith strained to hear what had caught his attention, finally detecting the low murmur of voices carried on the breeze. The sheriff motioned them forward again, moving with increased caution until they reached a natural outcropping that provided both cover and a view of the canyon floor. From this vantage point, Faith could see the holding pen Vaughn had described, a large corral constructed of logs and wire, containing dozens of cattle. Even from a distance, she could make out the broken F brand on several of the animals nearest to them. "There's your proof," Campbell whispered. Clear as day. Faith felt a surge of vindication mixed with anger. Her cattle, her livelihood, had indeed been stolen by Morgan's operation, just as she had suspected. The question now was how to document this evidence and use it against him. The sheriff produced a small brass spyglass from his coat pocket, using it to scan the area more carefully. "2 men guarding the entrance," he reported quietly, "and a camp with what looks like 3 more by the corral." 5 against 3, Vaughn murmured. "Not ideal odds, but not impossible either." "We're not here for a gunfight," Campbell reminded him, "just to document the evidence. If I can get close enough to identify those men and confirm the brands on the cattle, that's all we need for now." "And if they spot us?" Faith asked. "Then we withdraw and return with the marshal," the sheriff replied firmly. "I'm not risking your life in a shootout, Miss Faith." They watched the camp for several minutes, noting the routines of the guards. One man patrolled the perimeter of the corral while another sat cleaning his rifle by a small fire. The remaining 3 appeared to be playing cards in the shade of a canvas lean-to. "I'm going to circle around to get a better look at those brands," Campbell decided. "You 2 stay here. If there's trouble, head back up the trail to the horses." Before either of them could object, the sheriff was moving, keeping low and using the natural contours of the canyon floor for cover. Faith held her breath as she watched him make his way toward the corral, stopping periodically to ensure he remained undetected. "He knows what he's doing," Vaughn reassured her quietly. "I hope so," Faith replied, unable to shake the feeling that they were tempting fate by being there. Campbell had nearly reached the edge of the corral when disaster struck. A 6th man, previously unseen, emerged from behind a large boulder where he had apparently been sleeping. He spotted the sheriff immediately and shouted a warning to his companions. "Intruders." The man yelled, reaching for his sidearm. Campbell dove for cover as the first shots rang out, finding shelter behind a fallen tree trunk. The other rustlers scrambled for their weapons, fanning out to surround the sheriff's position. "We have to help him," Faith said urgently. Vaughn was already on his feet, his revolver drawn. "Stay here," he ordered, then whistled sharply a signal to Campbell that help was coming. Faith watched in horrified fascination as Vaughn moved with surprising speed down the slope, using the terrain to conceal his approach. He reached a position flanking 2 of the rustlers and opened fire, his shots precise and controlled. One man fell immediately, the other ducked behind a water trough. The remaining rustlers now faced attacks from 2 directions, dividing their attention between Campbell and Vaughn. Faith could see the sheriff returning fire from his position, forcing the men near the corral to keep their heads down. For several tense minutes, the gunfight continued, the sounds of gunshots echoing deafeningly off the canyon walls. Faith remained frozen in her hiding place, her heart pounding so loudly she was certain it would give away her position. Then, abruptly, the shooting stopped. Faith peered cautiously from her vantage point to see 3 of the rustlers lying motionless on the ground. A 4th was clutching his leg, clearly wounded. The remaining 2 had their hands raised in surrender as Campbell emerged from his cover, rifle trained steadily on them. Faith released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding and began making her way down to join the men. As she approached, she could hear the sheriff questioning the captured rustlers. "Who hired you?" Campbell demanded. "Was it Morgan directly, or did he work through intermediaries?" The men exchanged glances but remained silent. The wounded man groaned, clutching his bleeding leg. "You might want to start talking," Vaughn suggested coldly. "The charges just escalated from rustling to attempted murder of a law enforcement officer. That's a hanging offense." Fear flickered across the faces of the captured men. The older of the two finally spoke. "Morgan didn't hire us directly. It was Delaney, his foreman. Said the boss wanted certain ranches pressured to sell." "And the cattle?" Campbell pressed. "What was the plan for them?" "Move them to the railhead at Green River once the brands were altered," the man replied. "Delaney has contacts there who don't ask questions." Faith approached cautiously, her gaze drawn to the cattle in the corral. Among them, she could clearly see her own stock animals she had helped raise from calves, now destined for anonymous slaughter if the rustlers' plan had succeeded. "We have our evidence," she said quietly to Vaughn, who had moved to her side. "Now what?" "Now we take these men back to town and file formal charges," Campbell answered, having overheard her question. "With their testimony and the stolen cattle as evidence, we can build a case against Morgan and Delaney." "Morgan won't go down easily," Vaughn warned. "He still has men in town, and he'll know something's wrong when these fellows don't report in." The sheriff nodded grimly. "That's why we need to move quickly. We'll take the wounded man and one of the others. Vaughn, can you handle getting them back to town while I secure this location?" "What about me?" Faith asked, unwilling to be sidelined. Campbell considered her for a moment. "I need someone to ride to the Thompson ranch. Jake Thompson owes me a favor, and he's no friend of Morgan's. Ask him to bring some of his hands here to help guard the cattle until we can sort out which belong to which ranch." It was a task of genuine importance, not merely a way to keep her out of danger, and Faith appreciated the sheriff's recognition of her capabilities. "I'll go immediately," she agreed. As they prepared to separate, Vaughn taking the prisoners toward town, Faith heading for the Thompson ranch, and Campbell remaining to guard the evidence, Faith found herself reluctant to part from Vaughn. They had shared intense days together, facing dangers that had forged a connection between them deeper than the brief acquaintance might suggest. "Be careful," she said quietly as he secured the prisoners to their horses. "Morgan's men will be watching the roads." "I'll take the long way around," he assured her. "You do the same. The Thompson place is east of here, isn't it?" Faith nodded. "About 5 miles. I should be able to reach it within the hour." Vaughn's expression softened as he looked at her, concern evident in his eyes. "Faith, if anything happens, nothing will happen," she interrupted firmly. "We'll all meet back in town by nightfall." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Yes, madam." They parted ways, each with their assigned task, the weight of what they had discovered, and what still lay ahead pressing heavily upon them. Faith rode hard for the Thompson ranch, her mind consumed with the implications of the day's events. If they succeeded in bringing Morgan to justice, it would mean safety for her ranch and others like it. But even then, the financial troubles that had plagued her father remained unsolved. Jake Thompson proved as reliable as Sheriff Campbell had suggested. After hearing Faith's abbreviated explanation, he immediately called for his hands and organized a party to ride to the canyon. Within 30 minutes, 6 armed men were on their way to assist Campbell in securing the stolen cattle. "Your father was a good man, Miss Forrester," Thompson told her as she prepared to return to town. "Always treated folks fair, even when times were hard, not like Morgan, buying up land through trickery and threats." The older rancher spat to emphasize his disgust. "Been wanting to see him get his comeuppance for years." Faith thanked him for his help and set off for Montrose, taking a circuitous route as Vaughn had advised. The sun was beginning its westward descent, casting long shadows across the rolling landscape. Faith estimated she would reach town shortly before dusk. Her thoughts turned repeatedly to Vaughn as she rode. In the span of mere days, he had become central to her world, not just as an ally against Morgan, but as someone who understood her determination to save her family's legacy. The intensity of her feelings toward him was unsettling, yet somehow inevitable, as though their paths had been meant to cross in this time and place. Faith was so absorbed in these reflections that she nearly missed the riders approaching from the south. She reined in penny sharply, guiding the mare behind a stand of cottonwoods for concealment. From this vantage point, she could see a group of at least 10 men riding hard toward town. At their head was Silas Morgan himself, his face set in grim determination. Heart pounding, Faith waited until they had passed before continuing, now with increased urgency. Morgan was clearly gathering his forces for a confrontation. She needed to reach town and warn Vaughn and the sheriff. Montrose appeared deceptively peaceful as Faith approached from the east, the setting sun gilding the simple wooden buildings with golden light. But as she drew closer, she could sense the tension in the air. Few people moved along the boardwalks, and those who did hurried with purpose, glancing nervously toward the saloon where a cluster of horses indicated a gathering inside. Faith rode directly to the sheriff's office, hoping to find Vaughn there with the prisoners. Instead, she found the building empty, with signs of recent activity, coffee cups still half full, papers scattered across the desk as if abandoned in haste. Concern mounting, Faith crossed the street to the hotel where the owner, Mrs. Adler, had always been friendly with her family. The older woman's expression registered relief when Faith entered the small lobby. "Miss Faith, thank goodness you're safe. There's trouble brewing. Where's Sheriff Campbell?" Faith interrupted. "Or Mr. Westfield? The sheriff hasn't returned to town, Mrs. Adler replied, lowering her voice though they were alone in the room. "As for Mr. Westfield, he brought in 2 prisoners about an hour ago. Morgan's men tried to intercept them at the edge of town, but Mr. Westfield managed to get through to the jail. And now, where is he, Mrs. Adler's expression grew troubled. "Morgan arrived with more men shortly after. They've surrounded the jail. Mr. Westfield is inside with the prisoners and young Billy Stevens. The sheriff deputized him before riding out this morning." Faith felt her blood run cold. Vaughn was effectively trapped, outnumbered by Morgan's forces, and lacking the authority of the sheriff's badge to keep the confrontation civil. "Has there been any violence?" she asked. "Not yet," Mrs. Adler replied, "but Morgan's been drinking and his men are getting restless. It's only a matter of time before something happens." Faith moved to the window, peering cautiously toward the jailhouse at the end of the street. She could see men positioned around the building, some openly carrying rifles. Morgan himself stood on the boardwalk outside the saloon, deep in conversation with his foreman. "Is there another way into the jail?" Faith asked, turning back to Mrs. Adler. "A back entrance, perhaps?" The older woman considered for a moment. "There's a delivery door that leads to the storeroom. The key should be in Sheriff Campbell's desk. He sometimes gives it to me when supplies for the prisoners need to be delivered." "I need to get to Vaughn to Mr. Westfield," Faith corrected herself quickly. "He needs to know that Sheriff Campbell will be returning with more men soon." Mrs. Adler's eyes widened slightly at Faith's slip, but she merely nodded. "Wait here." The woman disappeared through a door behind the front desk, returning minutes later with a small brass key and a bundle of fabric. "The key to the back door," she explained, handing it to Faith. "And one of my son's old coats. With your hair tucked up under a hat, you might pass for a boy long enough to reach the storeroom unnoticed." Faith accepted both with gratitude. "Thank you, Mrs. Adler. Your mother was my dearest friend," the older woman said softly. I couldn't face her in the hereafter if I didn't help her daughter now. With the hotel owner's assistance, Faith transformed herself into a reasonable facsimile of a young man, her split riding skirt passing for trousers beneath the oversized coat, her hair pinned tightly and hidden under a worn slouch hat. The disguise wouldn't withstand close inspection, but in the gathering dusk, it might allow her to move through town without immediate recognition. Mrs. Adler showed her to a side exit that opened into the narrow space between the hotel and the adjacent mercantile. Follow this alley to the back of the buildings. The jail's storeroom door faces east, toward the livery. Faith thanked her again and slipped out into the deepening shadows. Moving cautiously, she made her way along the rear of the buildings, staying close to the walls and avoiding the patches of light spilling from windows. She encountered no one until she reached the open area behind the livery, where a young, stable hand was closing up for the night. Keeping her head down and her movements purposeful, Faith crossed quickly to the back of the jailhouse. The storeroom door was solid oak with a small barred window set at eye level. She inserted the key with shaking hands, turning it as quietly as possible. The lock released with a soft click, and Faith eased the door open just enough to slip inside. The storeroom was dimly lit by a single lantern, the shelves stocked with basic supplies, tinned food, ammunition, blankets, and other necessities. Faith could hear voices from the front of the building, Vaughn's distinctive baritone among them, though she couldn't make out the words. She moved carefully through the storeroom to the inner door, which opened onto a short hallway. The cells were to the left, the sheriff's office to the right. Faith paused, listening intently to determine the positions of those inside. "Morgan won't wait much longer," came a young voice, presumably Deputy Stevens. "He's got the building surrounded." "He won't attack a jail directly," Vaughn replied, his tone measured. "That would cross a line even he isn't willing to step over. He's trying to intimidate us into releasing the prisoners." "And if the sheriff doesn't return soon," Stevens sounded nervous. "He'll return," Vaughn said firmly, "and he'll bring help." Faith pushed the door open slowly, revealing herself. "He will," she confirmed. "Thompson and 6 of his hands are already at the canyon securing the cattle." Vaughn spun toward her, surprise and then relief washing over his features. "Faith." "How did you?" he broke off, taking in her disguise with a raised eyebrow. "Clever." Deputy Stevens, a gangly youth barely out of his teens, looked equally startled. "Miss Forrester, what are you doing here?" "Bringing news," she replied, removing the hat and shaking out her hair. "And a warning. Morgan has at least 10 more men with him. I passed them on the road into town." Vaughn's expression hardened. "That explains the increased activity outside. He's consolidating his forces." Faith moved to the window, peering carefully through the slatted blinds. The street outside was now populated with Morgan's men, some openly carrying weapons as they established positions around the jailhouse. "They're preparing for something," she observed grimly. "Morgan knows we have evidence and witnesses," Vaughn said, joining her at the window. "He can't allow that to reach a judge. But attacking a jail—" Faith shook her head. "That's madness." "Desperate men do desperate things," Vaughn replied quietly. "And Morgan is desperate. If word gets out about his rustling operation, everything he's built will collapse." The 2 prisoners watched this exchange from their cell, their expressions a mixture of fear and resignation. They clearly understood their value as witnesses and the danger it placed them in. "What can we do?" Faith asked, turning back to Vaughn. "Hold out until Campbell returns with reinforcements," he replied. "The jail is defensible, solid walls, limited access points. As long as they don't set fire to the place, we can keep them at bay." As if summoned by his words, a voice called from outside. "Westfield, I know you're in there." This is Silas Morgan. Vaughn moved to the front door but stayed to the side of the window, avoiding presenting a target. "What do you want, Morgan?" "A simple exchange," the rancher called back. "Release my men and we'll forget this unfortunate business." "Your men confessed to rustling cattle under orders from your foreman," Vaughn replied loudly. "That's not something we can simply forget." A pause followed then. "I'm willing to compensate Miss Forrester for her loss, double the value of the stolen cattle. Surely that's a fair resolution." Faith stepped forward, her anger overtaking caution. "My cattle aren't for sale, Mr. Morgan, especially not to the man who stole them." She could almost feel Morgan's rage from outside as he recognized her voice. "You're making a grave mistake, Miss Forrester. I'm offering you a way out of this situation with your life and some compensation. The alternative will be far less pleasant." "Is that a threat?" Vaughn called. "Merely a statement of fact," Morgan replied, his tone hardening. "You're outnumbered and surrounded. The sheriff is nowhere to be found." "How long do you think you can hold out?" "Long enough," Vaughn answered confidently. "The U.S. Marshal has been telegraphed. Attack a jail and you'll bring federal forces down on your head." Another silence followed, longer this time. Faith could imagine Morgan conferring with his men, reassessing his options in light of this information. Finally, his voice came again, now with a different offer. "Miss Forrester, I'm speaking to you directly now. This situation has escalated beyond what either of us intended. I propose a private meeting, you and me, at your ranch tomorrow morning. We can resolve our differences without further bloodshed." Faith exchanged a glance with Vaughn, who gave a subtle shake of his head. "Why would I trust you after what you've done?" she called back. "Because I'm offering you what you want most, the deed to your ranch, free and clear," Morgan replied. "The note your father signed, torn up before your eyes. All I ask in return is your silence about today's misunderstanding." The offer was tempting in its simplicity, the ranch secure, her financial troubles erased with a single stroke. But Faith knew it came with an invisible cost: her integrity. "And what about the other ranchers you've driven out?" she challenged. "The Collinses, the Hargroves, do they get their land back too?" Morgan's laugh carried clearly through the door. "You can't save everyone, Miss Forrester. I'm offering to save you." "At the price of my conscience," Faith replied. "I decline." "Then you leave me no choice," Morgan said, his voice hardening again. "Delaney, prepare the men." Vaughn moved swiftly away from the door. "They're going to attack. Stevens, check the ammunition supplies. Faith, help me barricade these windows." They worked quickly, overturning desks and pushing filing cabinets against the most vulnerable points. Young Deputy Stevens distributed ammunition with shaking hands, his face pale but determined. "I've never been in a real gunfight," he admitted to Faith as he handed her a shotgun. "Sheriff Campbell said I probably never would be in a town like Montrose." "First time for everything," Faith replied with more confidence than she felt, checking that the weapon was loaded. Her father had taught her to shoot for protection, though she had never fired at another human being. Vaughn positioned himself near the front door, his revolver ready. "Remember, they want the prisoners alive to silence them. That works to our advantage. They can't simply burn us out or shoot indiscriminately." "Small comfort," Faith murmured, taking up position near a side window where a gap in the barricade allowed her to see out without being exposed. The first attack came moments later, a coordinated rush from multiple directions. Gunfire erupted as Morgan's men attempted to reach the doors and windows. Vaughn and Stevens returned fire selectively, aiming to wound rather than kill when possible. Faith held her position, the shotgun steady in her hands. When a shadow appeared at her window, attempting to pry open the boarding, she fired without hesitation. The blast caught the man in the shoulder, sending him stumbling backward with a cry of pain. "Good shot," Vaughn called from his position. The initial assault lasted less than 5 minutes before Morgan's men withdrew to safer positions, leaving one of their number lying motionless in the street, and at least 2 others wounded. "They'll try again," Vaughn warned during the lull. "Probably from multiple angles next time." Faith reloaded the shotgun, her hands steadier than she had expected. The reality of their situation was sinking in. They were outnumbered, with limited ammunition and no certainty of when help might arrive. If Morgan's men were determined enough, eventually they would find a way in. "How long can we hold out?" she asked quietly, moving closer to Vaughn. "As long as necessary," he replied with that calm certainty that had drawn her to him from the beginning. His eyes met hers, and in them she saw not just determination but something deeper, a promise made without words. "Faith, if this goes badly—" "It won't," she interrupted, unwilling to hear whatever contingency he was preparing to voice. "If it does," he continued firmly, "I want you to know that meeting you, fighting for you, has been worth everything that came before." The simple declaration stole her breath. In the midst of danger, with bullets having just flown past them and more certainly to come, Vaughn had offered the closest thing to a declaration of feelings that their circumstances allowed. "No one has ever fought for me," she realized aloud, the words emerging unbidden. Vaughn's expression softened, his hand finding hers in the dim light of the jailhouse. "I always will," he promised softly, "however this ends." A crash from the rear of the building shattered the moment. "They're trying to break through the storeroom," Stevens called, already moving to defend the new threat. Faith and Vaughn separated, returning to their defensive positions as Morgan's men launched their second assault. This one was more determined, with concentrated fire directed at the rear door while others attempted to draw their attention to the front. The next half-hour passed in a blur of gunfire, shouted orders, and tense pauses as both sides regrouped. Faith lost track of how many times she fired the shotgun, how many men fell back from her position. Her world narrowed to the immediate tasks of loading, aiming, firing, and moving to wherever she was most needed. They had just repelled a third major assault when the sound of distant riders approaching from the north caught their attention. Vaughn risked a glance through a gap in the barricade. "It's Campbell," he announced with palpable relief, "and he's brought an army." Faith peered through her own vantage point to see the sheriff riding at the head of at least 20 mounted men, Thompson and his hands, joined by other ranchers from the surrounding area, and what appeared to be townspeople who had taken up arms. Morgan's forces, now caught between the defenders in the jail and the approaching reinforcements, began to scatter. Some fled immediately, others sought cover from which to assess the changing situation. Morgan himself remained visible on the boardwalk outside the saloon, his face a mask of rage as he watched his advantage evaporate. The arrival of Sheriff Campbell and his impromptu posse turned the tide decisively. Faced with overwhelming opposition, most of Morgan's hired guns surrendered or fled. Morgan himself attempted to escape on horseback, but was cut off by Thompson and 2 of his hands. Within an hour, the jail that had been under siege now overflowed with prisoners. Morgan and his foreman were secured in one cell, the original rustlers in another, and the remaining captured men were being held under guard in the town hall across the street. Faith found herself on the boardwalk outside the sheriff's office as the last of the prisoners were processed, the night air cool against her skin after the stifling heat of the besieged building. Vaughn joined her, his presence a solid comfort at her side. "It's over," she said, still hardly believing it. "This part is," he agreed. "There will be trials, testimonies, Morgan has friends in high places who will try to help him. But the evidence is overwhelming, Faith pointed out. The stolen cattle, the confessions from his men. Yes, Vaughn acknowledged. I believe justice will prevail in this case. They stood in companionable silence for a moment, watching as the town slowly returned to normal, citizens emerging from their homes now that the danger had passed. What happens next for you? Faith asked, suddenly afraid of the answer. Vaughn's job for the Stock Growers Association was essentially complete. There was nothing keeping him in Montrose. He turned to face her fully, those gray eyes thoughtful. That depends. On what? On whether there's a reason for me to stay, he replied softly. Faith felt her heart quicken. What reason would be sufficient? Vaughn's hand found hers again, his touch gentle but sure. A partnership, perhaps. The Broken F could use someone with experience running cattle. Are you applying for a job, Mr. Westfield? Faith asked, a smile tugging at her lips despite her attempt at a businesslike tone. I'm suggesting something more permanent, he clarified, his gaze unwavering. If that would be of interest to you. Faith considered him in the soft light spilling from the sheriff's office window. 3 days ago, he had been a stranger. Now, she couldn't imagine her future without him in it. The realization should have frightened her, but instead, it felt like coming home after a long journey. It would be of considerable interest, she replied carefully, though her smile betrayed the formality of her words. Vaughn's answering smile transformed his features, erasing the lines of tension and revealing a warmth that few were privileged to see. Then, I believe my plans are settled. Just like that. Sometimes you know, he said simply. From the moment I saw you standing up to Morgan, refusing to be intimidated despite everything stacked against you, I knew you were someone worth fighting for. Faith stepped closer, propriety temporarily forgotten in the emotional aftermath of their ordeal. And I knew, watching you risk your life to help a stranger, that you were someone worth trusting with my heart. Their future held challenges, she knew. The ranch's financial troubles wouldn't disappear overnight, and Morgan's influence would take time to fully dismantle. But standing there with Vaughn, Faith felt a certainty she had never known that whatever came next, they would face it together. 1 year later, Faith stood on the porch of the Broken F ranch house, watching a spring thunderstorm roll across the distant mountains. The land looked different now, renewed, somehow, like her own life had been. The trials had proceeded as Vaughn predicted. Morgan and his foreman received lengthy prison sentences for organizing the rustling operation. With the evidence of their methods exposed, other ranchers who had been forced to sell came forward with similar stories. While not all could reclaim their land, the compensation ordered by the court had provided many with fresh starts elsewhere. For Faith, the greatest victory had been not just keeping her ranch, but seeing it thrive again. The recovered cattle had formed the nucleus of a new herd, now expanded through careful breeding and management. Vaughn's experience with cattle operations had proven invaluable, his innovative approaches helping the Broken F become profitable again within the year. The sound of boots on the porch boards announced his arrival. Faith turned to see her husband of 8 months approaching, his smile as warm as the day he had proposed right here on this porch, after the last of the legal proceedings had concluded. "Storm's going to miss us," he observed, coming to stand beside her at the railing. "Good news for the new calves." "And for the roof," Faith agreed, leaning into him as his arm circled her waist. "The last thing we need is more leaks to patch." Vaughn chuckled, the sound rumbling pleasantly against her side. "I thought you enjoyed our midnight bucket brigade during the last downpour." "I enjoy sleep more," she retorted, though her smile belied any real complaint. They stood together watching the weather. comfortable in their shared silence, a comfort that had deepened with each passing month of their marriage. Faith sometimes marveled at how completely her life had transformed in just 1 year, from the desperate solitude following her father's death to this profound partnership. "I had a letter from Sheriff Campbell today," Vaughn mentioned after a while. "The last of Morgan's legal appeals has been denied. His sentence stands." Faith nodded, feeling the final weight of that shadow lifting from her shoulders. "Good, though I almost feel sorry for him in a way." "Why's that?" Vaughn asked, genuine curiosity in his voice. "He spent his entire life accumulating land, power, influence, and now he has nothing." Faith shook her head. "All that effort wasted on things that couldn't bring real happiness. Unlike us poor ranchers," Vaughn teased gently, "struggling with drought and blizzards and ornery cattle." Faith turned in his arms to face him directly. "Exactly unlike us," she agreed with complete sincerity, "because we have what matters." The ranch was thriving again, true, but that wasn't what she meant. What mattered was the home they had built together, not just the physical structure, but the life they shared within it. The long evenings planning for the future, the shared burdens that seemed lighter for being carried together, the quiet moments of connection that sustained them through difficult days. Vaughn's expression softened as he understood her meaning. "Have I told you today that I love you, Faith Westfield?" "You have," she replied, rising on tiptoes to press a kiss to his lips. "But I don't mind hearing it again." His arms tightened around her, solid and secure just as he had been from the moment he entered her life. "I love you," he murmured against her hair, "and I always will." Faith closed her eyes, savoring the certainty in his voice and the promise it contained, the same promise he had made that night in the besieged jailhouse, when they had faced death together and found something worth living for instead. "And I will always love you," she whispered in return, the words carrying all the gratitude and wonder she felt for this man who had fought for her when no one else would, who continued to stand beside her through every challenge and triumph. As the distant storm moved on and the sun broke through the clouds, painting the ranch in golden light, Faith knew with absolute certainty that whatever the future held, they would face it as they had faced everything since that fateful day together. Partners in all things, their love a fortress no hardship could breach.